Welcome to Stop the Noise, where small business specialists cut through the clutter to hone in on practical things small business owners can do to solve business challenges and move their business forward. In today's episode of Stop the Noise, hosts Brenda Thompson from the Better Business for Good company and workplace process architect Kerry Ann Nelson from Operation Verve are talking with sales process specialist Peter Burgess from Process Culture and IT specialist John Brickus from Accelero IT Solutions about how to use client forms and automation to dramatically cut your paperwork and eliminate boring and repetitive office tasks. So let's talk about the advantages of using online forms over paper forms. Peter, do you want to kick us off with that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brenda. Look, it's really, at first glance, it seems to be rather a dry topic, but it's actually the use of forms, electronic forms in a business can be quite transformative. If you take a paper form, a typical, Word document printed out and someone's filled it in with a pen, or even it's typed in manually and then printed out, you've got an asset that may be stored on a file system somewhere, or can be passed around in the meeting, but it's not easily shareable. So you could, for example, create a Word document. You can share it via Google Drive, or you can share it in different ways, or send it via email, but it's still a document and the data is embedded in the document. But if we then introduce an electronic form, and then we have either members of our team or the customer filling in that information online via their smartphone or on their PC or on the laptop, they are then inputting that data, which we can then pass into another system, for example, a CRM or your marketing automation solution. And then you can take that data and use it in multiple different ways. So firstly, we can take the data and then we can store it, for example, in a CRM, and it becomes the definitive record about the customer. It could contain their name and their address details, their phone number, etc. And we've got now that form transformed into a store of data about that customer. But also filling in that form can then kick off a whole bunch of different things. So automations in the business can lead to processes actually automatically starting and running in the business. So there's a lot you can do with an online
form. How much time, John, you might want to do, well, either of you, how much time can we realistically expect to save by that just sounds so cool.
Yeah, I can jump in there, Brenda. One example I used in my business was I'd get an email from a client say, "Oh, I've got a new staff member." And I'd go, "When are they starting?" And they go, "Give me a date." And they said, "What software do they need?" And then they give me and on. I had about 10 emails. I go, "This is a waste of time." So I created a form, an online form, and I said, "Here's all the options, and you tell me, when are they starting? What's their name, first name, last name, which computer are they using, which software, what permissions are they given, et cetera, et cetera." So it made everything so much more efficient because we made them provide the information we could then use to fully configure that client. Just the amount of toing and froing had stopped, and I got all the information in one spot. And it meant I, as a business, didn't need to be, my technician could look after that part of the process. So it becomes more standardized. So that's one little example, and there's millions of examples like that in every business where we're just spending too much time, chasing information. And then when we get the information, we have to chase through 5 documents and 6 emails to put it together to actually do anything with, and that takes time. So
and I'm guessing it's not just your time either, it's also the customer's time, because all that toing and froing while they go look up the answer to the next question and the next question and the next question,
I know
that's a huge time waste for them. Whereas if they can see, here's this form, this is all the information I'm going to have to supply, I'll go away and get it, fill out the form. Well, you've probably halved the time they're wasting as well.
Yeah, well, even in my private, my daughter's soccer team, I said, well, we've got to sort out what size shirt do they want. So I just put on a little form that says, what's your name and what shirt size, small, medium, large. And it sounds really basic, but otherwise I would have to chase through probably, 15 emails and write it in a spreadsheet and then send it somewhere, whereas it just collects it automatically. It was, 30 seconds to set up, and it probably saved me half an hour of collation.
Yeah.
And that's let alone some of the automation in the background that Peter's talking about, which is the next step.
It's really cool. Which kind of, I'm going to get to the next question, Peter, because I think that led into what technology you would use beautifully. But I got the sense that you actually wanted to contribute to that, how much time you're going to save answer as well. I saw you go, yeah.
I did. Well spotted. You know, I didn't want to interrupt John, but at that particular point, what occurred to me was that something, a pattern I see again and again. Think about, let's say you've got a meeting with a customer. You might be a lawyer or an accountant, and there are certain forms they have to fill in ideally before they meet you. So, and what happens is the customer turns up either physically to meet you or on a Zoom call, during these times, and they're not ready. So they haven't filled in the form. So you said, oh, have you filled in that form? Oh, sorry, I forgot. Can you send it to me again? I couldn't find the email, or whatever it was. So they haven't filled in the form, and you may then have to reschedule because that form is required before you can talk to them. Or, for example, they haven't made their initial payment. So you're then going to talk to them. You're having a meeting with them. They still owe you some money. And then you have to send them an invoice, and then they don't pay you, and you have to chase them up. So there's that whole process. There's all these inefficiencies around interacting with a customer. But if we can then add automation in, so we can actually make sure that you cannot book a meeting with us until you've filled in the form, and you cannot book a meeting until you've made the payment, and we can then link them all together. We can assure that by the time they come and sit down with us or meet us online, they've actually filled in the form, they've made the payment, and they're good to go.
Yeah, I certainly use that where Form A that links to Form B. You hit submit on the form, and that takes you to the meeting booking and so on. So it takes them through a process as well. Yeah, so cool. So which does though lead into what technology do you use to enable that really cool stuff happening?
That's right. Well, a lot of the technologies are really quite economical, and they're very readily available. So often there's so many choices, so many different technologies we can choose. And it can be quite overwhelming to decide what to choose and what will work for you. I personally, with my clients, I use either Google Forms or Jotform, and I find Jotform to be very powerful. Other people could use Typeform, for example. These are just electronic forms that have lots of capabilities. For example, they allow you to build forms with different types of controls, input fields, date selectors, drop downs where you can select multiple values. But they also allow you to define which fields are mandatory, which fields are optional. There's also smarts in Jotform, for example, when someone fills in a specific set of fields, then other fields will appear. And if they don't select those fields, they'll disappear. So we can have fairly dynamic forms. And then when those forms are filled in and a submission is made, you've filled in, you can either save a partial form or you can submit the entire form. That information can then be via a tool like Zapier, for example. We can then integrate that information into your CRM or push that information into another system where we can do some more work with it. So I recommend online forms like Jotform. If you're in the Microsoft world, I'd have to defer to John, because John knows a lot more about Microsoft Forms than I do.
John, did you want to contribute to that?
Oh, just quickly. So Microsoft do have a piece of software called Forms, surprisingly, and we might already have it without knowing it, because it is included in most packages. So, and then Microsoft also have other automation in the background. Their version of that is called Power Automate. So putting a form in is pretty straightforward. So I've written a guide on that. The automation's a bit more complicated. We need the tech whizzes to do some of that, but it's not that expensive to do.
Yeah.
In fact, it might almost, in some instances, it might almost be, free.
Yeah, I guess Google Forms is free, isn't it? And then I think
you've already paid for it. Yeah, it's part of a package that you pay for.
And then Jotforms, I think, is about $40 a month or something like that. It's not,
yes, around about that level. It's not vastly expensive. However, there are some limitations with Jotform, in the sense that if you want to have it on your own domain, you have to upgrade to an enterprise license, and that requires 5 seats, so it's a bit more pricey. But there are ways to get around some of the limitations, and you can customize and brand visually the emails, and you can brand the look and feel, so it looks like a corporate form.
Yeah.
And then if you have it within your website, for example, a WordPress-based website, we can create a redirection so you can actually give your customer, mydomain.com/form, and that will then forward to the form. So you can kind of get a fairly good experience. And one thing to mention as well, like the Power Automate that John mentioned, that's it's pretty economical for most cases and pretty powerful. I do find it a bit clunky, but I recently had a form that created a set of folders automatically in OneDrive, and then we use Power Automate to actually create a SharePoint folder and documents in SharePoint. So using these technologies, I was able to cross over from the non-Microsoft world to the Microsoft world, from the the world of open source and cloud-based to Microsoft's world, which is also cloud-based.
Yeah. So I guess it's really a matter of looking what your needs are, and then if it's pretty simple and you can use like the Jotform or the server, those kinds of forms, then you can do it yourself. If it's a little bit more complicated, then you go talk to the Johns and the Peters of this world. Does that kind of sum that up?
I think that's a good summary. I think a lot of it's accessible. Like the Jot forms are fairly accessible for the non-technical user. But once you get, like with all these things, once you get a little bit beyond the standard, then you perhaps need to talk to someone who has some experience.
Yeah. But then if you think about the amount of time we've talked about saving, sort of your hourly rate or your team's hourly rate, then it's not going to be it's going to be a really good investment in terms of time saved in the future, I would imagine.
Oh, definitely. I think this opens up that whole discussion around investment versus cost, which is perhaps not for this session, but a lot of people, especially when you're just starting in business, you could perhaps see everything as a cost, but developing an online form that automates the onboarding of your customers is really a fantastic investment, because the amount of time you would spend manually inputting all this information and manually chasing up customers, could be quite significant.
Absolutely. Well, I think that probably brings us to the point where we can actually start working on the to-do list. That concludes the first part of today's session. Now it's time to open up the checklist, where Peter and John will walk you step by step through your to-do list for creating your forms and using them effectively to automate the office work in the background.